In the early 1960s, as the world watched Yuri Gagarin orbit Earth and return a hero, whispers began to emerge. Strange radio signals, unexplained transmissions, voices calling out from space but never answering back. Were these malfunctions, hoaxes, or was something far more disturbing buried beneath the triumph of the Soviet space program? In this episode of Lost History of Space, we dive into one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries of the Cold War, the Lost Cosmonauts. It began with two brothers in Turin, Italy. Achille and Giovanni Judica-Cordiglia were amateur radio operators, fascinated by the new frontier of space. In a makeshift lab inside a World War II bunker, they built an array of radio antennas and began listening, not to local frequencies, but to the stars. And what they captured shocked them. In November 1960, they recorded a transmission, heavy breathing. Then, faintly, a human heartbeat. The Soviets had not announced any launch. Days later, silence. A few months after, in February 1961, they captured something more chilling. A voice, a woman's voice, speaking in Russian, repeating a single phrase over and over. It translated roughly to, I am hot, I see flame. Then static, forever. The Soviet Union never confirmed these flights. No names were released, no wreckage reported. But the brothers claimed to have documented 9 separate transmissions from what they believed were secret Soviet space missions, all of which ended in death. The official Soviet narrative was clear. Yuri Gagarin was the first human in space. There were no others before him. But the timeline is suspicious. US intelligence reports and later declassified documents from Eastern Europe suggest the Soviets were desperate to beat the Americans at any cost. That included launching test pilots and cosmonauts in hastily constructed capsules, some of which may never have returned. Take the case of Vladimir Ilyushin. A decorated Soviet test pilot, Ilyushin was rumored to have launched into space days before Gagarin in April 1961, but crash-landed in China after an orbital malfunction. He was never publicly acknowledged as a cosmonaut, and his family denied any involvement. But the coincidence of his disappearance and sudden hospitalization in China sparked decades of speculation. Then there was the report from March 1961. Western radio operators picked up a signal resembling a spacecraft losing altitude. The voice was calm at first, then distressed. One translation reads, "We are going down, we are burning." Again, there was no official Soviet launch on record for that date. Critics of the Lost Cosmonauts theory argue the Judica-Cordiglia brothers were mistaken or even fabricating their claims. But experts in radio engineering have reviewed their recordings and found them technically plausible. The brothers also logged telemetry patterns consistent with spaceborne transmissions. If it was a hoax, it was remarkably sophisticated for 2 young men working in a makeshift bunker. The more likely truth: the Soviets conducted test flights with human passengers before Gagarin, and some ended in catastrophic failure. But to admit such losses would have shattered the myth of Soviet space supremacy. So they were erased, scrubbed from records, denied publicly, and buried along with their capsules in the vacuum of history. In the 1990s, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, some documents emerged suggesting early suborbital tests involving cosmonauts, none of whom survived. One name surfaced repeatedly: Sergei Shiburin. No official biography, no cosmonaut registry, but his name appears in internal memos referencing flight casualty procedures. Others, like Andrei Mitkov and Irina Solovyova, were trained extensively but never flew, and later vanished from program rosters with no explanation. There are also oral histories, accounts passed down among former Soviet engineers and personnel who claimed unofficial knowledge of missions that ended in failure and silence. One retired technician, in a post-Soviet interview, described recovering a burnt spacecraft hull that had not been part of any documented mission. Another spoke of sealed launch logs that listed names and coordinates but were never shared with command staff. The Soviets had every reason to bury failure. The psychological and political damage of losing cosmonauts in secret would have been immense, especially as American achievements gained global attention. And with the KGB closely monitoring leaks, most insiders took what they knew to their graves. Why would they risk so much? Because space was more than science. It was a battlefield of ideology. Beating America meant proving communism could conquer the cosmos. Every success was global propaganda. Every failure, a potential death blow to Soviet pride. And so, lives were gambled. Capsules were launched with inadequate testing. Some never returned. Others returned in silence. In one suspected case, a crew burned up on re-entry, their voices captured in a grainy transmission now archived in museums across Europe. It ends with a final word: why? Meanwhile, on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Western intelligence agencies were listening too. The CIA, MI6, and even French and Japanese surveillance outposts monitored Soviet telemetry data. Some of their declassified files describe unexplained launches, transient signals, and unidentified orbital objects tracked for short durations before disappearing. These glimpses added fuel to the theory that not all Soviet space launches were accounted for. Perhaps the most tragic part of this story is how these cosmonauts, if real, died not in glory, but in denial. Their families were never told. Their names were never honored. In a regime obsessed with control, even memory was erased. Modern researchers continue to comb through archives, satellite data, and oral testimonies. They build timelines, cross-reference anomalies, and seek collaboration across former Soviet republics. Some believe that within the growing mountain of declassified materials, the names and stories of the lost cosmonauts may finally be verified. Others argue that without full Russian cooperation, we may only ever see pieces of the puzzle. Yet the voices remain, static-filled, fragmented, lost in the noise of time, yet undeniable. So the next time you hear the story of Gagarin, remember the others, the ones who may have gone first, the ones who fell into silence. This is not alternate history. This is the history we were never meant to know. This is the story of the lost cosmonauts.